Welcome to today's webinar titled, How Your eLearning Program Can Benefit from Recently Released Funding. This webinar is sponsored by SmarterServices in collaboration with Innovative Educators. So, good afternoon to you. I'm Mac Adkins, founder and Chief Academic Officer for SmarterServices, and I'll be serving as your moderator today. Let me tell you a little bit about the expert panel that we've convened for you. First, Dr. Patric will be our primary source of truth for today. He's the Vice President of WICHE's Policy Analysis and Research Unit, which oversees a range of research projects and post-secondary policy initiatives focusing on improving access to and success in post-secondary education, with a focus on those groups that have been poorly served by our existing systems. In working closely with WICHE's 16 members, he helps states, systems, and institutions adjust to rapidly changing regulations and legislation. We can all relate to that over the last year, right? So Lane completed a PhD in public administration at the University of Colorado, Denver. Shantee Siebuhr is coordinator of student resources at Weatherford College. She is a first-generation college student who now holds a Master of Education in Higher Education Administration. So congratulations on that, Shantee. Helping students thrive in today's academic world is her passion. She said that she reaches her goal when they reach theirs. Today, she will share how she used CARES money to fund her online orientation programming. These orientation programs were used to support new students as well as prepare online learners. She'll also discuss how she incorporated online student success videos to support learners throughout the year. I also recently learned that when she's not serving students, she's raising goats. She has a goat farm, which houses 14 miniature goats. So welcome, Shantee. Today's webinar is free, and the purpose is not to sell you anything, I promise, but it's to equip you to potentially buy several things that could benefit your e-learning students using federal funds. Many of you are already clients of SmarterServices and you understand the services that we provide, but for those who not, we do provide 3 services to e-learning programs. We're best known for the Smarter Measure Learning Readiness Indicator. It's an assessment that quantifies learner readiness based on non-cognitive factors. Basically, it measures grit so that you can identify at-risk learners. Next, we provide Smarter Proctoring, which is the only proctoring platform that not only provides virtual proctoring, but also manages face-to-face proctoring modalities as well. Our newest modality, called hybrid virtual proctoring, is a combination of those two and allows personnel from your institution, such as testing center staff or faculty, to serve as the live virtual proctors. And finally, we provide Smarter ID, which uses keystroke recognition and/or facial recognition to authenticate learners during an online course, not just during the exam. This is especially useful in courses that may utilize authentic assessment instead of proctored exams. So, on to our topic for today. In our conversations with clients, we often hear perspectives expressed such as, the federal funding early in the pandemic was great, but all of that funding is gone now, or I'm sure the deadline is passed. Or maybe they say something like, we have some needs that would be good if we could pay for them with federal funding, but since we've paid for them in prior years with other non-federal funds, I don't think that would be allowable. Or maybe they say, I'm sure that all the federal funding available to institutions in my state has already been used up. Well, today, Dr. Lane is going to provide a level of clarification about these and other perceptions. What he shares today just may surprise you. I don't want to steal his thunder, but the fact is there are still millions of dollars of federal funding that can be used to fund the services that companies like SmarterServices and Innovative Educators provide. So without further ado, Dr. Patric Lane.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Mac, and thanks everyone for taking the time to join us today. Providing clarity on 3 massive pieces of federal legislation is quite a charge. I don't know that I'll be able to live up to that, but I'll do my best. And not to steal my own thunder, but to push back on one thing that Mac said, I would say it's billions, not millions, that are still available out there. So we'll get to that as we go through this. There is a lot of money out there. And I'll start with a caveat. I feel like if you ever hear lawyers or financial advisors present, there's often a very formal disclaimer and waiver at the beginning. And as far as the federal legislation that I'll be discussing today and the regulations that go with them, I can only share that we at WICHE have been following this information very closely and sharing in the sometimes consternation and confusion of states and institutions and others that are trying to parse the language, the regulations, the guidance, and figure out what's allowable. But what follows is not meant to be, specific legal advice, and ultimately any specific questions about eligibility, allowable uses, et cetera, should be worked through with your institutional counsel, and I would strongly suggest the department's grant managers. They're very willing to help and great people, but they are a limited staff, and there are a lot of questions coming in, so the demands on their time are large, but they are great resources. With all of that being said, I'll go ahead and talk through the COVID-19 support legislation and discuss how it may be applicable. And as we go, I'm happy, as Max said, to take questions. They'll be monitoring the chat box, and we can handle more general ones at the end. I'll also give you a warning that one of my more popular answers may be, let me get back to you on that. In the hopes of trying to be as precise and accurate as possible, if there are questions that really merit specific reference to statute or federal guidance, I may punt on those for now, but provide you a written answer with some links to back it up after the fact, but I can work through Mac and his team to send those out. So as a bit of background, here's a quick description of WICHE. We're one of the 4 interstate compact organizations. Our members range, as you can see on the map here, from the Dakotas all the way out to the Pacific, where Guam and the Commonwealth and Northern Mariana Islands are members, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands is joining as of July 1st. And we have a fairly broad mission, focusing on increasing access to and success in high-quality post-secondary education for all residents of the West. We work in numerous areas. Mac mentioned the portion of WICHE that I oversee, but we also work directly with institutions on a number of fronts, including WCET, which folks on the call may be more familiar with, the WICHE Cooperative for Educational Technologies, which is sort of an oddity in that it's a national membership organization hidden within a regional higher ed compact. But those of you who have interacted with WCET, you know that they focus generally on technology-mediated education and are widely considered as a great group of policy experts and practice experts for distance ed and higher ed technology issues. For what it's worth, WICHE also has an extensive behavioral health program, as our founders back in the 1950s recognized you couldn't succeed in higher ed without strong behavioral health supports. And this is probably even more true today and continues to be a major focus of our work. It's not really relevant for a conversation today, but I do try to work that in because I think it is so important. And as we go through the presentation, I've got a couple spots where I'll pose questions to all of you as a group. They'll be very straightforward yes or no questions, and I'll just ask that you use your raise hand button to signify yes to respond. That's sort of our only option. And when it makes sense, I'd really welcome you to add a little bit of context to your yeses or your nos in the chat box. The reactions using that should be pretty straightforward. And you'll get plenty of warning as we get to those. Mac, if we could go to the next slide. So what we're here for today is to dive into the different pieces of federal legislation providing COVID-19 relief funds. The title of the webinar focused on ARPA, but as I'll describe, I think it's also important to understand the other 2 pieces of legislation, because at the end of the day, behind the scenes and underneath all of the grant administration language, it's essentially one funding program that's coming to higher ed. And as everyone is hopefully familiar with these 3 major bills, they provided substantial direct and indirect funding to higher ed institutions. We'll go through some general background first so we're all on the same page. And as I talk through these bills, I'm going to focus on the major portions of funding that are coming to higher ed. So we'll skip over and not address some of the many other different buckets of funding that are included in the massive bills. These include things like direct allocations to territories, which are certainly important. The same goes for tribal allocations. And separate funding pots for for-profit schools. Those were mainly focused on providing only student emergency aid, so it's less relevant to this discussion. And essentially, there's just so much that we could talk through that we could spend an entire webinar just on one bill, and we wouldn't get to hear all the great information from our colleagues at the institutions, which is what I think most folks are here for. So the CARES Act was the initial legislation. As a reminder, it passed in March 2020, just as the pandemic was really picking up steam. The bill totaled a little more than $2 trillion, which is a really big piece of legislation. Of that, only $14 billion was allocated directly to higher ed through the acronym that everyone following federal policy has come to know and love, the HERF, or Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. The bill provided $14 billion to that fund with an allocation formula that we don't have to go into in detail, but relies on full-time equivalent enrollments with heavy weighting on Pell eligible students. There are also other buckets of funding worth knowing about. The GEAR Fund, Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund in particular, that's essentially a block grant to be used at governor's discretion to help drive the response of the education sector to the COVID-19 pandemic. For this legislation, the GEAR Fund amounted to about $3 billion, allocated generally based on population numbers of school-age students and poverty levels. So of that big allocation to HERF, institutions are required to use at least 50% of that funding for emergency student grants with relatively few strings attached. Initially, eligibility was limited to those students who are eligible for federal financial aid and excluding those enrolled in exclusively online programs. This was all done initially through informal guidance issued by the department well after the enactment of the law and quickly challenged in a handful of jurisdictions around the country to broaden that eligibility. And in most of those cases that made it to conclusion, the department did not prevail. So there was sort of a weird situation where eligibility differed depending on where you lived. After the change in presidential administrations, an interim rule issued by the department was replaced with a final rule that broadened eligibility essentially to any student enrolled at or after the declaration of a national emergency. But the other half of that funding is what's of particular interest today. So we'll talk more in a second about how institutions can use those funds. There's some fairly general and broad uses, and coupled with the fungibility of funding, that may allow institutions a lot of flexibility to use the money in creative ways to help support students. After the CARES Act, it seems Congress had run out of creative ideas for acronyms, and they enacted and President Trump signed broader legislation containing the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act. The consensus seems to be that we pronounce this as CRSA, and it provides almost $23 billion to higher ed through the HERF. This bucket is known officially as HERF 2, and it also contained a GEAR fund, that's the governor's discretionary fund, of about $1.3 billion. The allocation formula here tilted a little bit to allow institutions to spend more on institutional expenses and less on direct student aid. The bill required institutions to spend at least as much of this allocation on direct student aid as it spends on emergency student grants under the CARES Act. But given that the bill was about 60% bigger, you can see essentially that the extra money was allowed to be spent for institutional needs that we'll talk about in a second. Last and most recent is the American Rescue Plan Act, which I call ARPA. You'll hear people call it ARP, so who knows. But this was another piece of legislation in the $2 trillion neighborhood, enacted by Congress and signed by President Biden in March 2021. This legislation allocated almost $40 billion directly to higher ed, so that's more than the other two pieces of legislation combined. There is no GEAR fund in this pot of funding, but there was significant state, territory, tribal, and local government funding in the amount of $350 billion. It was not earmarked for education, but certainly as some states and other localities are looking to spend that money, some of it is making its way into the education sector. The uses of this fund are controlled through the Department of Treasury rather than the Department of Education. So it's got a different set of grant managers and everything else. The other pieces of legislation, particularly the CARES Act, also had some general purpose state response money that at least one or two states passed on to higher ed. But as far as we can tell, it was not very widespread. So to sum up, this is a whole lot of money, significant resources. Just for context, the annual federal spending on Pell Grants runs to about $30 billion per year. So you can see we're well north of that in a very short period of time. I think it's also really important to remember the context of when this all came out and when the pieces of legislation were enacted. If you think back to March and April of 2020, when the CARES Act was enacted, things were crazy to say the least. Institutions, as you all well know, were standing up remote programs on the fly, trying to get the necessary hardware and software into the hands of students, faculty, and staff, and stand up remote programs and keep the semester going. And all this came as we learned to focus on a new important budget category in higher ed, the auxiliary revenue, which those in the CFO's office know all about, but for the rest of us, maybe we didn't understand how important it was in protecting the overall institutional fiscal health. Room and board, parking, etc. It makes up a not insignificant amount of institutional budgets. So there's great concern about how institutions would cope, and the money was designed to offset some of those expenses and lost revenue. Now, as we fast forward to CRSA and ARPA, there's more recognition that we, somewhat successfully weathered the short-term issues. We were able to move a massive number of courses online and provide a reasonable quality of education. But the pandemic, and even with successful vaccination rollouts, is going to have long-term and lasting impacts on higher ed and our student populations. So now we get a chance to take a breath and assess where students and institutions really need support, how the pandemic was impacting different groups in their pursuit of higher education, and how best we might be able to target that money. The good news is that both CRSA and ARPA are still relatively flexible. The money is there to continue to support different types of activities in response to the pandemic, but if you look through the guidance and regulations very closely, to make strategic investments to really help students, including by focusing on issues that are central to student success and may have been heightened by the pandemic. What we've seen and heard across the West is that institutions and state government are approaching things in very different ways. Some states have established commissions to issue binding plans on the distribution of federal dollars allocated to states, while others are convening cabinet-level working groups to develop plans. And in other places, state legislatures weighing in very directly with legislation dictating where things should be spent. In some rarer cases at the institutional level, we've heard of from program level staff who have received inquiries from higher ups along the lines of, what could you do with $1 million? It's a situation where it certainly pays to have grant proposals, that you've just got sitting in the cabinet ready to dust off. And underscoring the importance of shovel-ready projects, to borrow a term from the Great Recession. So here, I'll pause and take a breath for our first audience participation question. Remember to use your Zoom raise your hand button for yes, and the opposite of that isn't necessarily a no, but we'll sort of get a sense of what people think. The question is this: at your institution, have you been approached or had opportunities to identify possible program spending or ideas to make use of federal funds to support students? Again, raise your hand for yes, nothing for no. And if you do say yes, as we see those reactions coming in with a fair number of people indicating yes, I'd really invite you to share a sentence or two in the Q&A, or excuse me, in the chat box, just about what you did with that, any other info about the opportunity, that'd be terrific. If you did not have that opportunity or have been denied in that request process, please feel free to add that context as well.
Patrick, while the attendees are giving that input, we did have one question that you can shed some light on. I think the answer to this is yes, but I'll let you clarify. So you did mention that CRSA is sometimes referred to as HERF 2. Is it also the case that ARPA is sometimes referred to as HERF 3?
Yes, that is correct. And complicating things is that essentially each of these subsequent buckets of funding, you can think about it as them replenishing the HERF funding pot. So institutions are getting the same grant, and as we'll talk about in a second, it has some important implications. So as they issue guidance on HERF 3 relative to the ARPA funding, it also applies back to some of the earlier pots of funding, unless, of course, they explicitly say the CARES Act money had different requirements, and here's where that is relevant. So it is a sort of a complicated mess, but yeah, the HERF3 is the ARPA money. And another question, are you asking if we offered or received funding for anything only directly for higher ed? Buying laptops and webcams, I think, is another example that's pretty widespread and appropriate, I think, as a response as well. And if we could jump on to the next slide then, Mac. And I'm not going to read through these word for word, and remember the caveat that I'm not a lawyer. But I will say that these provisions are drawn from the Department of Education issued frequently asked questions related to ARPA, which, as we just talked about, is the HERF3. In many ways, this applies to the other bills because it governs the use of HERF, and much of the language is identical to earlier guidance. But that's a starting point for our discussion. And it's important to remember that ARPA has a lot of money directed to higher ed in its bottom line. But if we look through the Department of Education spending tracker, and we'll show more about this in a minute, it's clear that there are many, many cases, and maybe even the majority of state and institutional grantees where the majority of funds have yet to be spent. So back to Mac's introduction, the idea that the money is all used up just doesn't hold up to what the department is showing us. And next is a question that inevitably comes up about the deadlines for using funds for each of the programs. Essentially, each grant has given institutions and other grantees in the higher ed universe 1 year to spend the money, but there's an important catch, and that is that the clock essentially is reset with each additional funding program. So if you received your first CARES Act allocation in April 2020, that would give you a deadline of April 2021 to use that money. But that deadline gets extended when you receive the CURSA or ARPA money. The department also made it clear that there are no cost extensions that will be in play for all of these programs. And that catch is contained in the ARPA 3 guidance, and this will be one of the links that you'll get on the resource sheet that the team will send out to you after this. So if there's one piece of advice with using these grants, it's to take care of your emergency related things, but then to take a breath and figure out the best course of action for your students in your institution. There is not necessarily a big rush to spend the money down. The bullets on here are very general. Other guidance included the following language that I think is important. Among the allowable uses are, quote, to support additional academic or mental health support systems that will help students overcome additional barriers that have arisen as a result of coronavirus that may otherwise prevent them from completing their education. Again, this is from the HERF3 frequently asked questions. And I think you can look at a suite of student services and support programs for e-learning, which is likely a modality that we're still going to see major increases compared to our pre-pandemic baseline. Anything that would help students in that vein certainly seems to us to be an allowable expense. There are some specific ones that we'll talk about in a second that are not allowable. But it's also important to acknowledge that in ARPA, there are a couple of new required uses of funds for monitoring and suppressing COVID and conducting outreach to financial aid applicants, but I won't spend too much time on those. Back to the allowable uses, the language is pretty broad, and that phrase I've put in bold there really doesn't capture the full range of uses, but if you do go into detail in the FAQ documents, which again are probably your best reference, you do have a lot of freedom. It's also important to recognize the lack of so-called, quote, supplement, not supplant language. For those that may not be familiar, usually in federal funding programs, you'll see a provision in the legislation that prohibits grantees from replacing funding for activities that are not traditionally funded, or excuse me, that are traditionally funded from other sources with these new federal dollars. Essentially, they don't want you to take federal money and use it to pay for something you've been paying for all along. That does not exist in any of the higher ed funding mechanisms. In the big picture, the department and the administration is doing this with maintenance of effort requirements that essentially try to lock states into keeping their support for K-12 and for higher ed at roughly the same levels as pre-pandemic. But there is not specific supplement, not supplant language in any of the higher ed pieces. It is worth noting that those provisions do exist in a couple of other places in the bill that are completely unrelated to higher ed. So it's not like they just forgot or it's meant to be implied. If they meant to include it, they would have. And to follow up a little further, in some of the guidance initially issued on the ESSER, which is another wonderful acronym, but that's the K-12 pot of funding. There was specific guidance from the department acknowledging that there is no supplement, not supplant language, and that recipients of the funding are free to use funds in that manner. So that again gives folks a lot of freedom and recognizes that there were huge drops in revenue that could limit institutions' ability to provide funds the way they used to. It's also possible to use these grants to offset lost revenue. This is sort of a murky area that brings in tons of fungibility, but if you can document lost revenue, either through the loss of auxiliary revenue, drops in tuition or enrollments, you can charge the grant for that lost revenue. Once you've charged the grant for that lost revenue, in our view, it sort of becomes regular revenue that gets put into the general fund and reallocated for expenses. So within these broad use categories, it's possible to see how funding can support e-learning programs. And again, I'm required to acknowledge my lack of legal expertise, but as we all know, lawyers themselves often disagree about the interpretation of the same words. But what we'll do here is take another quick pause for a question that I'll put to all of you, and the question is this. Have your requests for e-learning expenses and supports been approved under these federal grants? Again, yes is raising your hand. No would be silence, but if you do have a no where your requests have been denied, we would love to see some additional context added in the chat box. And we'll be hearing more from some actual institutions in a second that will be terrific. And Mac, while those responses are coming in, if we could go to the next slide, we turn to unallowed expenses. Here you have the usual mix of things included in most federal grants, but also that is explicitly called out is anything that smacks of recruiting or marketing. Some limited expenses for re-engaging students who've stopped out are allowed, but this is an area that, given the department's attention to it in guidance and on webinars, is, I think, worth paying attention to. Alcohol, athletics, capital expenses for religious worship facilities are also areas of concern. But if you take all this information in totality, you can see the key is really identifying how additional expenditures supporting students through e-learning are really a response to the pandemic. And I think there's a very strong case to be made for that. And we could go on to the next slide then, Mac. And as the last piece before I finally stop talking and turn it over to our institution of colleagues, I just want to share quickly a few screenshots from the department's website that's tracking spending, partly because I think it's a great tool for transparency. It does have flaws and gaps, but it's pretty cool nonetheless. And just with the caveat that it's populated by federal reports filed by states and institutions, so it may not be exactly up to date. But you can see if you take a spin through it, how much money is remaining to be spent. You can very easily look at your own states and your own institutions. It's pretty cool. And I've looked through a fair number of states and seen many or most below 50% of the total expenditures. And this here is a screenshot of COVID relief spending in Wyoming. I don't share this in any way to pick on Wyoming. I just picked them because I know they have a small number of institutions and it's pretty easy to get some useful information for illustrative purposes. So this is really information that gives you a sense of how much money may be available. And if we go to the next slide, here we zoom in on the University of Wyoming. And as you can see, as of April, they'd spent just over 40% of their total funds, but you can also see the breakdown between what's been spent for emergency student funding, and what is available for institutional needs. Again, not in any way picking on them, because that's their numbers are fairly typical across the country. But I think that is useful as you're plotting out strategies to look for additional funding. And the link to that will be available in the resource document. So with that, Mac, we can go to the next slide. I will wrap up, and you can turn it over to others, and we'll take questions at the end.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Patrick. And I just want to reiterate that after the webinar, you will receive this resource document that's got all of these links that Dr. Lane has mentioned today, as well as several others. And one of those links, I spent some time with it yesterday. Of course, we're all curious about our own state, right? But for every state, you can go and see how much of this federal money has been spent and how much remains, which is really something more than just a curiosity. It's truly information that we can use. So Shantee Siebuhr, Student Resource Coordinator at Weatherford College, will be speaking next. So Shantee, I want to thank you for taking time from your busy day today.
Thank you.
To express that they are in the midst of one of their orientation sessions on campus. She has stepped away from her students to share this information with us. So thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me, Mac. Yes, so in March of 2020, we had an active task force working on redesigning our new student orientation. And what I like to call puppies and rainbows. I live in puppies and rainbows land, and we got together a bunch of people and we created these full day experiences for new students so that we could really focus on resources for students. And then just a few weeks after getting that approved, we went completely remote. And we thought, okay, there's really no way that we can do what we just spent months planning this summer for orientation for all of our new students. How do we make sure that they have the resources to be successful? And I fell in love with innovative educators and their products because, as Mac said earlier in the presentation, there's just something that's wonderful about watching your students succeed, especially, I serve as an academic advisor as well. I wear a few hats on campus, but I serve as an academic advisor, and I'll have students that come to me underprepared, nervous, not sure what college is going to look like, but they know that they want to be there. And it's an incredible feeling to then, 2-3 years later, sit in the stadium and watch them cross the stage because they finished their degree and they're headed on to their next challenge. And it's exciting. So whenever I find tools and resources that can supplement that student success, I tend to go all in. And it was very easy to get the rest of my institution on board when they saw what partnering with innovative educators could do for us. Mac, if you'll go to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. So what we ended up doing is we have a Guided Pathways leadership team, and many of you might be aware of Guided Pathways. It's the initiative where we look from start to finish at how our students are navigating higher education, and that we're making sure that we're removing obstacles, putting in resources, and that they're completing their degrees. We've taken our work very seriously at Weatherford College. And so we have a Guided Pathways leadership team that meets on all things student success. And it was an easy pitch to show what an online orientation could do for us in the time of the pandemic, and how the materials that we found would support our students. And I could probably talk all day about online orientation and success videos. It's where I live. So I actually would love to just show everyone Mac, is it possible for me to share my screen and give a little insight into what we were able to build? Thank you so much. I will pull this up. Can everybody see?
We are seeing your screen now.
Perfect. Okay, so we wanted to make sure that in the time of a global pandemic, which is something that we've never encountered before, that our students still felt connected to Weatherford College, that they still felt connected to their dreams and what they were hoping to accomplish. And orientation is just a very small part of that academic journey. But for some, especially for those that get to experience it in person, orientation is where you get pumped. Orientation is where you learn about your new school and how it can help you be successful. And we didn't want to lose that momentum and that dynamic by going completely online. So partnering with innovative educators with our go-to orientation, we built and launched this entire online orientation in 28 days. It was a team of 2 because we were still working remote. We were still doing academic advising over the summer, getting ready for fall. And then so many of our staff had been reallocated to student resources in a way that they were more working a triage type unit with student resources than trying to create new ones for us to be prepared for the summer. So in 28 days, we built this new student orientation. And what I love about it is we were able to take content we already had. So we had a newer president who had already started putting together some videos and really highlighting some features of our institution and programs that we have. And so we were able to repurpose those within our orientation, as well as build out some new product. I'd love to go ahead and show you our President's Welcome. This was our intention with this was to really capture our students just in the first few minutes. This is the very first screen that once they click online orientation, it takes them directly into this, and then they get to, and so hopefully you've got Sam.
Hello, I'm Todd Allen Farmer, President of Weatherford College. Whether you're looking to earn a bachelor's degree, a workforce certificate, or a few transfer courses, Weatherford College offers a high-quality education at an affordable price. Weatherford College is an all-Steinway institution. We have produced over 24 Grammy Award-winning artists. Our nationally ranked athletic programs have sent dozens of athletes to the pros. Meanwhile, we are rapidly expanding our award-winning academic programs. Weatherford College is a fun place to earn a world-class education. You too will discover why Weatherford College truly is a great place.
We got a lot of feedback that an engaging video when they first opened really helped them progress through the rest of their orientation. That was one of our favorite features of our orientation. Additionally, there's different modules that we were able to build out. Innovative educators put together a college highlight of different places on campus to try to keep them connected. My favorite feature that we were able to do is our flip cards. I would make everything a flip card forever if I could, because it's my favorite feature. Anytime we'd make a new page, we would say, oh, what kind of page do we want this to be? And inevitably my answer would be, let's just make it a flip card. It sounds great. But this helped our students because they weren't in person, they weren't able to meet with us face to face. This kind of gave them a little bit of personal connection. They got to know the student services staff, what they did. And then on the back, we put a little bit about them, what they do, how long they've worked there, a fun fact about that person. As you can imagine, my fun fact did have to do with goats. I'm starting to wonder if it's the only fun fact I have, because I've kind of made it my primary hobby. But it just kind of gave our students an option to connect with our staff and faculty as well, as they found their way through orientation and tried to get connected in a time where we were all craving that connection. In addition to learning about our people, we of course talked about our academic communities, our guided pathways, so that students could see what they could study, how they could study it, where they would live academically within Weatherford College. We were able to put together paying for college financial aid, assessment. All of these resources get to live in here so that when students, and this is probably a video, so I'm going to want to move it over. It's an automatic play. All of our pages were able to put videos and photos. Everything is closed captioned. A screen reader can pick up everything on this page. And then we were able to put all of our resources in one page or in one orientation for them. We put in about our campus policies, our culture of caring, our resources, campus life and how to get involved, which in summer of 2020 was limited to virtual. We've slowly started offering things face-to-face, like the orientation that we are doing today. And then we were able to break it down because we offered this online orientation to every new student, not just first time in college like we would typically do. So if you were transferring to Weatherford College, if you did dual credit, if you are a returning student after so many years, everyone had access to this orientation. So we were able to put personalized information for those students within this orientation as well. We talked about online learning. We dedicated quite a bit of time and resources to our online learning portion of the modules because, again, 2020, everything was online. And we had many students who lived far out enough that they didn't have Wi-Fi or internet. They weren't used to online classes, and we really needed to make sure that we had provided the services necessary for them to continue to be successful and not have to withdraw from classes. So we focused a lot on the hows and the whys, and in addition to increasing our Wi-Fi bandwidth and how far out into the parking lot it goes, we made sure that we did increase so that students could come and sit in their cars and use the Wi-Fi if they needed to while staying distant, not having to get out. This was in the height of the pandemic in last summer. So we just wanted to make sure that we were being as accommodating as possible. We did a virtual campus tour. We did videos with student advice from actual students. And then there's, of course, what you would normally have at the end of a orientation, which is your knowledge check to make sure, did you soak up what we needed you to? Was everything there, and how did it go? One thing that we did not anticipate with this online orientation was it became so much more than just an orientation. It became more than just a way for them to connect to the college. It became an actual resource that we found students using time and time again. So 6 months into, I believe it was around November, we realized we had this uptick in who was logging in and how much they were participating and what they were looking at. And it's because finals were right around the corner and they were trying to figure out, oh yeah, I read a resource about this, and they were using this orientation as an all year round resource. They knew this is where I can find the answer, even if I'm not sure where else to find the answer. So that became a wonderful resource. I have not seen the chat. It doesn't show me the chat, but I will go ahead and stop sharing eventually. There we go. So I want to be sure that I answer questions.
Before we do that, let me go ahead and share a couple of things here. First of all, thank you for sharing that example of how you used such funding to really improve the process, that while you had all this information that maybe you disseminated locally, now everything had to be online. And so you did a great job partnering with innovative educators to be able to do that. So thanks for showing us what it looks like. And
absolutely.
So before we move to our Q&A, I do want to share with you this resource that you'll be receiving. Dr. Lane put this together. It's a single PDF file, but you'll see there's several links on this document. There's about a dozen links there that you can follow. The purpose of this handout is to give you something tangible that as an e-learning leader that you can take to your leadership at your organization and say, hey, I've got a need. It's to improve our proctoring, or it's to improve our learner readiness, or it's to improve our orientation, or whatever your need is, to go to your organization and say, hey, what do we need to do here to use some of this federal funding? So I'm going to use that as kind of a segue into a first Q&A, Patrick. And while I'm explaining this, if the others of you have questions that you would like Dr. Lane or Shantee to address, please put that either in the chat or the question and answer box, and we'll speak to those. But Dr. Lane, if someone on this webinar is an e-learning director and they have a need for which they could use federal funding, and obviously the answer to this is going to differ from institution to institution, but put some words in their mouth. What do they need to say when they go to that CFO or whoever that is at their organization that doles out funding? What words can we empower them with to start the ball rolling?
I think the biggest thing is really to link it back to a response to the pandemic. So having some data about the explosion of e-learning, number of courses, number of sections, number of student hours, etc. And that really is the crucial link that essentially unlocks some of that federal funding. And then I think, there are, in those links that you'll be sharing, there are phrases about response to the pandemic, student support services, ensuring, there's language about ensuring that students will be able to complete their education. And if we think that these services are essential for students to complete their education, and I think there's some reasonable evidence around that, then I think it should at least get you in the conversation. And then it's, frankly, I think probably everybody's well aware of the competition that it turns into. There are competing priorities on every campus. There are competing priorities in every state. So it's about making that case based on your state's needs and your state's priorities and your institution. Excuse me, I talk a lot to state audiences, so it's hard to remember that there are in fact institutions sometimes. But yeah, there are competitions everywhere.
One of those silver linings of the pandemic for those of us involved with e-learning is that e-learning has become an institutional priority everywhere. Obviously through the pandemic, and now as we transition hopefully back to a post-pandemic environment. Just as Shantee was saying with her orientation, it was not a one-time event. Students did not go there, learn about the school, and then move on. It was a resource that they continued to use after the fact. So many of the resources that we as e-learning directors provide to our organization are that same way. And so as you're making the case for how you can use such federal funding to improve your processes, to improve the services you provide to your student. I mean, that's part of the rationale, right? That e-learning will continue to be a part of the learner experience to a larger degree for a long time. So I'm going to pause and see, Danielle, I've tried to keep an eye on the chat and the questions and answers. Do you see anything we need to address? Read maybe something that was answered that others may not have seen answered that we should address?
Yeah, it looks like there are a couple questions in here. And just so everybody knows, we will send that video out that Shantee was presenting. So that will be in the follow-up email next week for you guys. So it looks like there's two here, Mac. Looks like somebody, an anonymous attendee, asked, what was your biggest hurdle when putting all of this together? I'm not sure if they want to expand on that, but were there any hurdles with putting this together? I know, Dr. Lane, you had worked on quite a bit of extensive research for all the funding, and Shantee as well, putting together your programs also, if you guys want to speak on that.
I'll assume people want to hear from Shantee on this one.
Perfect.
But if not, I mean, I'm happy to talk through my research process for an hour, but I don't know.
Much like Dr. Lane, I could probably talk forever as well. Hurdle with today's presentation, I didn't have any. Like I said, I could talk forever. Hurdles when putting together our orientation, we had a very smooth process when from the moment we needed to ask for money, which can always sometimes be our biggest hurdle. The minute you come and say, hey, we would like to purchase this and this is what we're going to get out of it and how we're going to use it, that can be a hurdle in itself, which it wasn't, because it was self-explanatory as to how we needed it and the funds were there. I guess a miniature hurdle that we hit was our lack of people. The fact that it was myself and one other person putting together the orientation. It felt very daunting at first when we were like, how are we going to put together an entire orientation? We're just two people and we're academically advising on top of it. And don't forget there's a pandemic outside. So I've got to figure out how to order my groceries. My children want to eat. But partnering with innovative educators, they're so organized. We had one client, success person, Erin, who worked with us the entire time, so we didn't have to go between multiple people. Everything lived in these folder shares that we had access to at all times, so that as we made updates, they made updates, and so on. The communication was excellent. So it was daunting at first, but otherwise, I would say that putting together the orientation and getting it live in 28 days was probably, I mean, I look back on it and I think, wow, we did that, but it was easier than I could have ever imagined. Everything just went as though we needed to, which was fantastic because it was during a time when everything felt like it was not going well.
So many of us lived through those 28-day periods when we were transitioning so much in so little time. So certainly applaud you in that effort. As I was looking back through the chat comments, one thought did come to mind. We've had several clients to use federal funding to fund not only an annual license, but a multi-year license, 3, and in some cases, 5 years. And I think that may be a wise use of this funding because, like we said, the processes and the products that you're putting in place are not just to help the students now, they're improving your process as we move out of the pandemic. So, Patric, I don't know if you've seen anything in any of the rules and the regulations about multi-year licenses. I'm assuming it's allowable. We've had several institutions do that, but do you have any thoughts or reflections there?
I don't on that. I will defer, but I will commit to digging into it a little bit to see if I can identify something specific in the guidance one way or the other. I think in general, a lot of institutions have taken the approach that if it seems reasonable to them, there's nothing that says they can't, so we'll go ahead and do it. That all comes down to your comfort level as a general counsel with risk, I think. And if they're willing to do that, and doubt that the department would come after them for something that seems on its face pretty reasonable. It probably is. So, but I'll look into that a little more.
Yeah, so that if that's something that you'd like to learn more about, and we might be able to connect you to some of our clients that have used the funding. And someone just said funding has to be expensed within a year of award, but their interpretation was the expense was the one-time payment of a multi-year license. So, you know, I guess it's a bit semantic after that. So we are at the top of the hour. I hope that you found this information useful. Again, instead of reaching out to me directly, if you'd like to reach out to Dr. Lane or Shantee with a question, they'd love to hear from you as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.